Elizabeth Wydra and Josh Blackman, I'd like to hear from each of you what your initial reactions were when you heard that Neil Gorsuch was the nominee. Elizabeth, let me start with you.
Yeah, thank you. So I didn't think it was that big of a surprise. Obviously, his name was in the news, and, he's deeply beloved by conservatives, and, he's viewed to be a rock-ribbed conservative. He appears to meet the litmus test that Donald Trump put forth, which I find very disturbing, which we can talk more about in a bit.
What disturbs you about it?
Well, so normally we don't have litmus tests when we choose a nominee. The reason that bothers people is that the idea of a litmus test here, for example, Donald Trump said his were that the nominee would be willing to overturn Roe versus Wade, would vote for religious liberty that would protect evangelical Christians, and third, would vote in a way that would uphold the Second Amendment right to have a gun for individual use. The reason we don't like that, and we prefer more presidents think about judicial philosophy, et cetera, is because it gives this idea that a person is guaranteeing a vote in order to get the nomination. So the fact that this nominee is someone who would be willing to overturn Roe obviously concerns me. But I think one of my reactions more generally was to his professed originalism that Ken was talking about before. As you said, the idea that he looks at the Constitution as the framers of the Constitution intended it. So my real question is, what parts of the Constitution is he looking at? Because look, I consider myself actually a progressive who cares deeply about the text and history of the Constitution, but it's important to make sure you're looking at the whole Constitution. A lot of conservative originalists, and I would say Justice Scalia is a prime example of one, like to look at the Constitution as it was in 1789, but don't take into account the what I think genius, beautiful, and inspiring changes to the Constitution that have been made by we the people over the time, particularly those changes to the Constitution after the Civil War that wrote into the Constitution equal protection of the laws for all people, that vastly empowered the federal government to enforce guarantees of equality and liberty, that guaranteed the right to vote free from discrimination for women and people of color. Does Neil Gorsuch think that those guarantees are as important as the ones he might like the gun rights?
Speaking of cases that get cited, we're already getting some questions about some of Judge Gorsuch's previous cases, including the Hobby Lobby decision. Jess on Facebook wrote, "The Hobby Lobby decision seems to be the case most supporters land on when outlining their defense of him. How does this decision compare with the rest of his record?" Elizabeth?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think there's another wrinkle to that case that is important for a lot of us beyond just the troubling to me issues on access to contraception. And that's the corporate angle here. Corporate personhood is obviously an issue that is important in the campaign finance context and other First Amendment areas. But here, this was really the first time that corporations were given what had previously been individual rights of conscience under religious liberty protection doctrines. And so, for example, Constitutional Accountability Center, my group, filed a brief that was a progressive originalist brief right in Judge Gorsuch's wheelhouse that talked about the way that the framers of the First Amendment, of the religious liberty clauses in particular, saw them as individual rights of conscience and belief, something that corporations as artificial entities of the state simply don't hold. So for those of us who have deep concerns about Judge Gorsuch's record, his dissent in that case raises concerns on religious liberty grounds, giving an over protection to religious liberty grounds even when they extinguish the rights of women to contraception under a law that they are clearly entitled to contraception under. We're concerned about the reproductive choice issues and access. And thirdly, we're concerned about an overbroad vision of corporate rights. You know, a lot of Trump voters purportedly voted for him based on economic issues. And if you put someone on the court that adds to the very pro-business bent of the Roberts Court, our studies have shown that the Roberts Court is the most pro-corporate of the modern era, then they could have a rude awakening when they have someone there who's going to only entrench a court's bent toward bending over backwards to accommodate special big business interests at the expense of average Americans. And so we saw a strong opinion from the court last term reaffirming basically that you can't burden the right to an abortion and still pass constitutional muster. So it's very concerning that Donald Trump is intent, as he stated during his campaign, on putting someone on the bench who would be committed to overturning Roe versus Wade. And I think it's not just Roe, it's all these other issues that probably many of your listeners are concerned about: marriage equality, voting rights, civil rights.
We did get a question on Twitter probably several about marriage equality.
Yeah, and he hasn't ruled on that specifically during his time under the 10th Circuit, but he did write a column which I find concerning that criticized what he called liberal lawyers using the courts for what he called social issues. I don't really think of them as social issues. I think of them as constitutional guarantees, which I'm very glad that we over time have written into our Constitution. So to me, it's troubling that he views people coming into court and demanding that the court vindicate their constitutional rights, which is their right, and it's the court's duty to adjudicate those constitutional claims, that he views those sort of as, kind of intrusive follies put on by liberal lawyers.
Elizabeth Wydra, your organization, the Constitutional Accountability Center, has filed a friend of the court brief, an amicus brief, on behalf of GG. Talk about what's at stake in this case as you see it.
Yeah, absolutely. So it implicates, obviously, the important guarantee of equal protection for all people. And, it says the Constitution, when it's talking about equal protection, uses the word persons. Persons is obviously the broadest word that the framers could have chosen. And they, if you look at the debate, specifically chose a term that would be universal. Transgender people obviously are persons under the Constitution. And then we have laws that Congress passes to enforce those constitutional guarantees. Here we're talking about Title IX, which talks about not discriminating on the basis of gender in schools. So that's what we're talking about here. It also has an important wrinkle because the Obama administration issued an interpretation of Title IX saying that it applied to transgender students and protected them, particularly in these types of cases. The Trump administration might change that. And so the question is what the Supreme Court will do, whether they will go ahead with there is the possibility that they could just rule on the Title IX issue itself and not take into account any administration guidance on what that administration thinks. But I think it also raises the broader point that goes to the background of this nomination hearing and any of these cases that come up before the court, and frankly to the role of a judge or justice, him or herself. And that's the requirement that you are faithful to the law and the Constitution itself, that you are independent from the political party and the president who is responsible for putting you on that bench. And I think a lot of us have seen in the past few days the importance of the courts as a check on constitutional violations and overstepping of power from the elected branches in these Muslim ban cases. And so it's so important that Judge Gorsuch show in his hearing that he will be that type of independent judge, that he will not, as we've been talking about, come on the bench with a political agenda or some sort of loyalty to President Trump, whether it's through these litmus tests or whatever, but that he will be faithful to the Constitution, the whole Constitution, and the law itself.
Well, then let me flip it around a little bit to either you, Elizabeth, or you, Kenneth. What difference does it make? If the primary responsibility is to have someone who interprets the law as the law is intended and not to bring their own political litmus tests into it, why does the complexion of the court even matter?
I think, obviously, anyone, no matter what they look like, what nation they're from, in their ancestry, should be focused on the Constitution and the law. But I think that, as we've seen with some of the recent opinions, it does make a difference if you have a broad view of the reality in which law plays out on the ground. We've seen some very powerful opinions from Justice Sotomayor on the way that policing, and particularly intrusive policing, violent policing, affects communities of color. And I think that was very powerful, not just in informing the way that the law and the opinions were written from the Supreme Court, but in the way that people hear the Supreme Court speaking to them. The way that she writes, I think the affirmative action case is another example, is something that people can see themselves in, they can see their experience reflected in, and that's incredibly important when you have the Supreme Court issuing opinions that govern the most intimate aspects of our lives. And I disagree that there aren't any conservatives out there who are people of color or women on the bench because of, yes, there were a couple nominations. There was one, Miguel Estrada didn't work. Judge Brown is on the bench. So he could have picked someone who was not another white guy.
Let's talk about how the confirmation process might go. Here is a clip of Arizona Republican Senator John McCain from October of last year. He was speaking to a radio program in Philadelphia about the possibility of a different nominee winning the presidency.
I promise you that we will be united against any Supreme Court nominee that Hillary Clinton, if she were president, would put up.
That's Arizona Republican Senator John McCain speaking on the Dom Giordano program on WPHT. So he said that if Hillary Clinton had won, any nominee she would put up, it would be a solid stone wall. Elizabeth Wydra, are we expecting the same from Democrats this time around?
I think it would, the treatment of Merrick Garland, who is President Obama's nominee, the unquestionably qualified Chief Judge Merrick Garland from the D.C. Circuit, that is fresh in everyone's mind. I think that was unconscionable, the way that Senate Republicans blocked his nomination. Going into this one, obviously, there are people who view this as a stolen seat, that any nominee from President Trump is going to be illegitimate. But I think there is going to be a fight. The question is it a fight where we look very closely at his record, subject him to incredibly tough and fair questioning at a hearing, and then perhaps a lot of Democrats vote against him? Is there going to be a filibuster? I think a lot of it depends on, frankly, the review of his record, how he responds, and that's important. That's why we have these processes, and it's a shame that Merrick Garland was denied even a hearing, much less a vote.
Let's throw in one more question. Langham tweeted us, I wonder how your guests think Judge Gorsuch is likely to rule on organized labor cases. Elizabeth?
Yeah, I think that's obviously a real big concern. We've seen labor groups come out very strongly, either against or expressing very strong concern against the nominee. He has generally been very pro-business. He has ruled in cases against a claim of workers who were trying to seek back pay. There are also cases where he ruled against whistleblowers. So I think there's a lot of concern there. And this is frankly one of those issues that will be coming up to the Supreme Court very soon. One of the cases that basically didn't get decided because we had an 8-justice court was a case about labor unions and the ability of labor unions to take what we call fair share fees. That's that part of union dues that goes to organizing for common goods like better workplaces, better pay, better benefits, etc. The court split on that, and so we need a 9th vote, and Scalia probably would have voted against labor unions in that case. I think a lot of people are expecting it to shoot back up to the Supreme Court, and business certainly hopes that Gorsuch will be the 5th vote to rule against labor unions, and labor unions obviously are very concerned about that.